The federal government is asking the Supreme Court of Canada to limit the use of the Notwithstanding clause, citing how repeated usage could undermine Canadians' rights. Federal Justice Minister Sean Fraser says that the ruling could shape how federal and provincial governments use the tool for years to come. Manitoba has shown support for Ottawa's case, while Alberta and Ontario support provincial use for the clause. Our contributor, David Clement, joins me now in studio for more on the debate. So, David, let's start with what is the Notwithstanding clause and why does it exist?
Yeah, so the Notwithstanding clause is Section 33 of the Charter, and it essentially allows either the federal government or provincial governments to enact laws that operate notwithstanding or in spite of potential violations of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, it's not all of what's included in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the things that it can apply to would be Section 2, which is like expression, religion, Section 7 through 15, which are legal rights, equality rights, etc. But it doesn't apply to other sections like democratic rights, the right to vote, you can't disenfranchise people, language rights, and mobility rights. And how it operates is it can be enacted. It lasts for 5 years. It can be renewed. And it essentially allows that law to stand, even though it may potentially violate aspects of the Charter. Now, why it exists, it goes back to 1982, Pierre Trudeau, then Prime Minister, repatriating our Constitution, looking to kind of solidify the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the reason why the Notwithstanding Clause exists is essentially as a compromise with the provinces. So at the time, the provinces were worried that if we had a very entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that would erode the concept called parliamentary supremacy, which is the idea that at the end of the day, the legislature is the ruling authority over the law of the land. And there were concerns at the time, and this is what supporters of the Notwithstanding Clause would argue now, is that if you skew towards judicial supremacy, you become or you mirror some of what we see in the United States. Like how many cases, or how many executive orders or laws have you covered where essentially the outcome is, well, the courts are going to have to decide. And everything goes to the courts, and ultimately the court is the arbiter of what stays, what goes, what's legal, what's not. So kind of in summary, it exists to counter potential judicial overreach. So that would be in instances where the courts have clearly gotten it wrong. I mean, there are a variety of instances where public polling shows that Canadians feel the courts have got it wrong. I'll use one, the Como case of the New Brunswick man who was detained and fined for buying alcohol in Quebec and driving to his home. I think most Canadians, when they saw that, were like, wait a second, that's illegal? You're not allowed to do that? Most Canadians would feel that the court got it wrong. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the province and against Como in that case.
Right.
It would be balancing individual rights and societal needs. And then the real kind of most important one is just facilitating constitutional agreement between the provinces to get all of the provinces on board.
And when has the clause been invoked?
Yeah, so in the early stages, early 80s, Quebec used it over 100 times for almost everything. That was largely in opposition to the constitutional proceedings at the time. They are by far, in comparison to all of the other provinces, the primary province who uses the Notwithstanding Clause. That's not necessarily a slight against the people of Quebec. I think it's just a test of the sentiment that Quebec has historically had the most uncomfortable relationship of all of the provinces with the federal government. It was used by the Yukon in 1982 over a land and development issue, Saskatchewan in 86 to put public servants back to work. Alberta controversially threatened to use it in the 90s over parental rights and sex education, as well as in response to marriage equality. In 2021, Ontario used it to change advertising election rules. But really, the crux of this is the two most high-profile examples right now is Quebec using it to solidify their secularism law, which in a nutshell says that you cannot be a public servant and wear any religious symbols, which when framed that way doesn't sound maybe that offensive, but in practice what that means is you couldn't have a Jewish man with a yarmulke be a public school teacher. You
Right.
couldn't have a female physician who wears a headscarf. You couldn't have a attorney for the province who wore any religious symbol. And then the other one, obviously, more recently, is Alberta threatening to invoke it over gender and pronoun rules in school. So it's, I would say, rarely used, predominantly used by Quebec, but I think these two high-profile cases are driving some of the discussion.
And why has there been such a strong response from the country to the Liberals asking the Supreme Court to review how the clause can be used?
Yeah, it's there's been almost like a very, forgive the expression, nerdy legal debate among the commentary class with the major papers arguing either for or against. But I think what has really pushed that vitriolic response is those two cases, right? It makes a lot of Canadians uncomfortable at the concept that a woman wearing a headscarf, regardless of her qualifications, could not be a teacher or a doctor, or insert any religious symbol and different person. That makes a lot of Canadians uncomfortable. Now, that policy is very popular in Quebec, overwhelmingly supported, and that's where things get complicated. And I think that that's part of the reason why Ottawa is seeking to intervene. Alberta, with their gender pronoun rules for schools, is another example where it's kind of invoking Ottawa to maybe try and react, or at least set a clearer table as to what the rules of the game are. And the other aspect here is that the provinces, this is the veto card for the provinces. And so the response from Quebec or Ontario or Alberta, it would be seen as just another encroachment of Ottawa in provincial legislating and decision making. And so that's why you're seeing some of the heavier pushback from the premiers, is that this is their veto card, essentially, so that laws don't end up like what happens in many instances in the US, where it's like, okay, well, we'll wait for the court to decide. This allows that to be kind of overstepped and say, this will be the law, and we'll invoke the notwithstanding clause regardless of what the courts say about the law.
And if the court does limit how the clause can be used, what would happen from there?
We would probably have a very serious constitutional crisis. First with Quebec, because they've been the primary user of the notwithstanding clause. But two, also, I think the bigger one would be the moment we're in as a country where we're trying to be one country, one market. To strip away that power from the provinces would make collaborating with the provinces much more difficult, right? How do you get a national energy transportation system approved that requires multiple provinces to sign on, pipelines and those things, when it could be perceived by the premiers that you're now trying to remove their one kind of veto card in response to either judges maybe getting it wrong, Ottawa overstepping, or not being able to enact policies that are the will of the people. That would certainly be Quebec's justification for their secularism law, regardless of how controversial it is everywhere else. It's not controversial in Quebec. And so their view is we're responding to the wills and wants of our electorate. And so we would probably have a very serious constitutional crisis. It would make it very difficult for the Carney government to be the nation builder that they want to be, right? Trying to get the provinces on board on all of these big issues that we're finally getting around to trying to fix. It's hard to do that if you're going to try and pull the rug out from the provinces by limiting or changing how the notwithstanding clause can be used.
And why do you think that Manitoba is taking the side of Ottawa and not of Ontario, Alberta? What's happening there?
Well, they just haven't had the history of using it. They haven't gotten to that threshold. And I would say if we rewound 10 years even, was very rare it was used. It's only more recently where we've seen it used to solve labor disputes. Ontario threatened to use it and then did, and then took it back with public servants. And so Manitoba is just one of those cases that they haven't really invoked it as a province. And I think Wab-Kinew, being on the NDP or more progressive side, views instances like how it's been used in Quebec, which largely discriminates against minorities, as something that is an affront to Canadian values, and would like to see the court determine that things like that are not what the notwithstanding clause is supposed to be used for.
Well, David, thank you for breaking that down for us.